iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hey, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for another session of the iHeartPodcast Speaker Series. For anybody that's watched this before, you know we've been doing this going on 2 years now. We started right at the top of quarantine when we felt like the world was sort of all scurrying off into our own corners and not hanging out as much. And we wanted to try to stay connected around one of our favorite topics, which is podcasting. We were, at the same time that quarantine was happening, we were seeing this medium continue to explode. And some of the coolest creators that we knew continuing to jump into it, to use it to tell stories. And it's evolved into this weekly, just honestly amazing series of conversations that we've had with everybody from Malcolm Gladwell to Will Ferrell to Charlamagne the God, to Laverne Cox, to on and on. It's just been awesome. And our way into these conversations is often podcasting, but we'll see where it goes from there, is usually how it goes. It gets into folks' origin stories, what drives them as creators. This week's guest is a partner of ours named Jim Jacobs, a newer member of the iHeartPodcast family, but just an amazing creator, specifically around kids content and podcasting, which in and of itself is a fascinating, just exploding space of creativity. So first of all, Jim, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. I'm sure that you have not one but 3 shows, and so there is probably stuff not getting done right now because you're hanging out with us. So I really appreciate you being here.
Oh, no, I'm looking forward to this. This is great. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, origin stories. I think the coolest thing about the podcast medium is that none of us, I've yet to meet somebody who started out their career as a podcaster. Most of us come from other mediums, sometimes totally different jobs and sectors we were in. And we just sort of happened into, first of all, storytelling, and then lo and behold, podcasting. Tell us your backstory, where you started, and when you realized I should probably do this as a podcast. But tell the whole thing, because I think it's an awesome story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think I'm one of those few that really podcasting is what broke through my career. And yeah, if we rewind several years, like I was working for a pharmaceutical company, traveling quite a bit. I'm married with 3 young boys who are now 4, 6, and 8. And at the time, this is pre-COVID, so this is 2019. I was traveling quite a bit and just missing a lot of bedtimes, that was a really significant part in our family culture of just me helping put the boys to bed, and we would just make up stories for fun. And I hear that from a lot of parents, that a lot of parents or a lot of kids are like, tell me a story, and a lot of parents don't know exactly what that means. And so we try and fumble our way through it. Well, after years of practice, I had formulated this recipe of a fun story for kids. And so my kids would just help make that story happen. And so when I was traveling, I was missing a lot of those opportunities. And my wife would literally start calling me, and I would be stepping away from a dinner or something and tell my kids a story over the phone. We're like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I just started recording them and as a voice memo on my phone and texting my wife that file, and it would just get lost in the text thread. And a couple of weeks of that, we were like, this is not working. I wonder if I could just put it on as a podcast, and just as a means of housing that content. So I started Googling how can I make a podcast from my phone? Like, it needs to be super simple for me to be able to do this on the road and wherever I am in the car or whatever. So I came across a platform that allowed for me to do that, and just started recording the stories straight from my phone, uploading them as episodes on the show so that my kids could listen on their iPads or my wife's phone. And it was great for our family. We were very happy. And then people started listening, which I thought was strange at first because I was telling these stories for my kids, and people left like great reviews saying, hey, my daughter loves your stories. Her name's Sophie. Could you make a story for her? She loves unicorns and rainbows. And I loved it. I was like, yeah, of course, I will totally make a story for Sophie and her unicorn dreams, because my kids get to benefit of these little creative hooks that were being sent in. And that's what began this whole thing. It was never supposed to be a thing. I did not start this with some big marketing plan, but it was just, I think I lucked into some good timing of COVID and the lockdown and kids being at home looking for things to do, and parents looking for screenless alternatives to Zoom school. And so that's where all these ideas started flooding in. I now sort through thousands and thousands of these submissions from kids, and Kid Short Stories is what evolved from that, where every episode comes from the ideas of kids all around the world.
There is so much to unpack in what you just said. It may sound just sort of like, oh, that's just my backstory, but like starting with, not everyone is that good at making those kinds of stories on the fly. So I have this image of you literally stepping away from a dinner and just thinking of, okay, what is it going to be tonight? Where does that come from? So like when you were growing up, did you have a mom, a dad, a friend that was, where did the storytelling gift come from?
So funny story is in middle school, I was always told that I was a terrible storyteller. All of my friends dreaded hearing me tell a story because there were too many details. It went on too long. It was too much. And they would always say, just get to the point already. And so I lived with that for a long time. Like my mom is a creative writer. She taught me a lot of creative writing, and but telling a story out loud to somebody was something that I was terrified to do, because I just got a lot of that was something people started targeting me for, of Jim's stories was a thing to avoid. And so I don't know, it's one of those funny things that sometimes the thing that you can be made fun of, or just grow up with this shadow over you, can sometimes become the thing that is special in a unique way.
Well, it's the details and the sort of specificity of stories that I think at least a lot of times make them great and hook you into those stories. And specifically with kids, I think you are genuinely the expert on this, having huge kids podcasts. I am a semi-expert on it, having just 4 kids, sort of like you, 3 kids. Yeah. But I notice with children, it is the sort of whimsy of stories, the really wacky detail and specifics of stories that they hook into, less so than the overarching hero's journey, so to speak. It's that sort of Dr. Seuss wacky detail off in the corner of a page. And maybe that's what you realized was sort of like your superpower as a storyteller. But I don't want to lead the witness. Like, does any of that make sense?
Yeah. So what I honestly, I didn't know that I had this recipe for a story, because all these stories, they're pretty short. They hover around between 8 to 12 minutes, which I found is a really great time or a length of time to get involved in a family's routine, whether getting ready for bed, being in the car, driving to school, during quiet time. Like, having their attention for about 10 or 12 minutes is a pretty sweet spot of a window. But yeah, over the past couple of years, I've started like teaching the kids. We'll hop on Instagram Live and I'll walk through, like, this is how I make a story. Can you help me make it with me? And so, a lot of the basic fundamentals of story, you have your background, your characters, an arc. You have I call it the dun 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 moment. Almost all of my stories have a specific dun 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 moment that is the point of the story. That is the climax, and it needs to be resolved, whether that's a treasure being found or Dr. Stinky Breath being stopped. That is the point of every story, needs that climax. And so communicating that to kids and yeah, the details the details are important. I want them to feel like they are there. And so making sure that you communicate the leaves that you're stepping on as you're walking down the trail. There's a unique language that you need to speak when you're speaking only through audio. There's a totally different storytelling format. If it's an animated show that they're watching, it's a different animation or a different narration happening versus an audio. And so just my attention to those details that I was always made fun of for, I guess, works pretty well for this medium.
And so the other piece I want to get into is that moment when you went from being sort of I just create for myself or my own kids to, wow, now I'm kind of like a content creator. And I've seen this with a lot of podcasters. Aaron Mahnke comes to mind, a podcaster that we do a lot of great shows with, who similar thing. He had a deep fascination with sort of the dark histories of the United States. He launched a show called Lore, and suddenly he was interacting with fans, a word he had never had really in his lexicon at all. What was that moment like where you're like, whoa, I have a fan. I don't know what to do with this thing.
Yeah,
it's like.
It's pretty innocent at first. Of these reviews started coming in, unsolicited feedback, and I grew up working at day camps or summer camps with kids. Like I've been around kids my whole life. I love hanging out with kids, and so that was really easy. But it was probably about 9 months, 12 months into the show where this whole time, like I was comparing to YouTube numbers, video metrics, as far as like if I was successful or not, which I've now learned is not a fair comparison. But it was 9 to 12 months in when I was doing maybe 100 or 200,000 downloads a month that I started joining these podcast groups, and they, mouths dropped open when they would see what this was. And it was then that I realized like how special this was. Parents started sending me a lot of money to say, hey, can you guarantee that my kid's story submission comes through? Like, here's a lot of money to make that happen for their birthday party. Or it was like, wow, this is turning into something really special and unique. It was about a year in. So I started in October 2019, and it was the summer, fall of 2020 that it really grabbed my attention.
Amazing. So the last thing in your sort of origin story that I want to remember and ask a question about is the screen freeness of podcasting. So you have 3 kids.
I do.
And I think that the way that kids interact with screens, you can read as much as you want about it, but until you have a young kid, you're never really going to see frontline firsthand, like, wow, screens are really powerful over kids.
The screen zombie. Yes.
Yes. And it's been really interesting for me. I have 4 kids, like I said, and they range from 16 to 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And to see screens become more a part of our lives every single year. I've even seen the change from when the 16-year-old was a young kid to my now 8-year-old new kid, just becoming more and more intense. Here comes podcasting. So podcasting as a medium has exploded. Kids podcasts are starting to, and I think will continue to explode and outgrow other genres, because I think it's going to happen where parents are going to realize this is an incredible alternative. But just talk about that for a little bit. Was that a realization to you of like, oh yeah,
absolutely,
also a screen alternative? But how did that develop?
Yeah. So I think there's been this evolution of content for kids. I think if we go back a decade or so, YouTube Kids or video content that was really accessible for kids to just keep clicking and keep watching, like there was this boom with that. And then the response was like, okay, we need to make this educational screened content. And so there's a big boom in that kind of attention. And then I feel like over the past 2-3 years, that educational screen content has been abused through all the like it's not as unique anymore. And so there's now just so much screen time that kids are facing. And there's so many studies showing that there should be some parameters of how much screen time a child at certain developmental phases, like how much they should be having. And anyway, so I totally see this shift into the explosion of kids' audio. To go back to the radio drama days of listening to books on tape, and that story of the power of a kid's imagination is so amazing. And I see video content for kids, which is, there's great video content for kids. I am not bashing video, but I think video content can sometimes be a passive consumption for kids, where they're just consuming, versus kids' audio, they're an active participant in that content, because they're like creating that world in their mind.
We see the same thing. Like we believe and see the same thing. I think, to put it simply, when we run surveys on how people listen to podcasts, candidly, at any age, kids or adults, they're in this lean in, teach me something, engaged mode, a learning mode. There's actually studies to show that it's even different from when you're listening to a podcast that is everything I just said, and even a playlist where you're like, now I'd like to lean back, escape from the world a little bit. I'm less engaged. Mm-hmm. Not good or bad, just a very different mode of listening. But certainly I see the same with my own kids, and it doesn't surprise me. You get into this brain turned off mode on video platforms these days that podcasting, I think, to be honest about it, doesn't allow. It's so engaging and so theater of the mind for kids. Yes. You have 3 shows: kids short stories, kids animal stories, and now Spyology. We'll get into Spyology in a second and what is it. But kids short stories, kids animal stories, you're literally seeing, like you said, kids creative writing, as it were. What's that like to have that sort of firsthand view into kids' imaginations? I mean, you said it's amazing, it's incredible. What really blows you away specifically about it when you witness it?
Well, first is I'm always asked so Kid Short Stories is a daily show. It's a new story every single day. And I'm always like, are you going to run out of creative idea, like an idea for tomorrow's story? Like, how do you know that you're going to be able to do this forever? You should see the data that I have of all these forms that kids and their parents fill out. They're so great. Like, I never would have thought of any of these things, but they're so easy for me to lean into, to build a story, because they're not sending these 3-page long essays. They're sending maybe a few sentences or a paragraph of this idea of an adventure that they want to go on, or something like that. And so, that creativity that they're working on is the bones of Kid Short Stories. So where Kids Animal Stories kind of fits in is there's a lot of, I can see like the different submissions, there's almost like different categories of them. Like, for one, this spy world has kind of evolved through Kid Short Stories, where every kid wants to be on this spy team. And Dr. Stinky Breath was our evil arch nemesis that evolved from that. He wants to take over the world to make everyone stop brushing their teeth and make it stinky, and all these fun things that it is fully kid created. And so it's like, okay, I kind of put that in the back of my head of like, okay, one day we need to branch this off into like a spy podcast. I think that deserves its own thing. But there were a lot of animal submissions as well, and kids wanted to learn more about animals. Like, so the secret fun fact about my background is my undergrad was deeply involved in zoology, and that's been a forever passion of mine is wildlife and the environment and animals and critters of I call them critters of all shapes and sizes. And so that is how Kids Animal Stories just was it was a way of kind of cataloging these different types of like I can have a kid short stories where one day is a unicorn, the next day is a dinosaur, and the next day is an alien. But kids animal stories can be a little more, you know what you're getting there if that's what you're looking for.
It's awesome. So the shows are part of a studio that we've established called Curativity. We've done this in partnership with Collab, a digital talent network. The third show now is Spyology. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Where'd it come from? What do you hope to do with it?
Yeah, so Spyology Squad is the third, or really the second child of kids' short stories, of this spy world that I mentioned. That is a science-leaning show. So every week there's 3 episodes that come out. It's a little older of I feel like I'm speaking to an older child or young adult, and so but each week there's a new science lesson, and so we don't go too deep into learning exactly how gravity works, but just like how Magic School Bus was for me as a child, or with my kids in Wild Kratts, there's lessons and pieces that we can take to make the story come alive, but they're learning along the way. And so each week is a new lesson or a new science topic, and it's done through the lens of Dr. Stinky Breath is trying to take over the world by utilizing this science thing, and it's up to this biology squad to try and figure out what in the world is going on.
Awesome. It's funny when you say Wild Kratts, I get such a good feeling because whenever I see it being consumed in my house, I'm like, oh, thank God you're not on social media. I think the reason I have that thought is because of not even the content necessarily that my young kids come across on social media or YouTube, whatever the case may be, but the ads, the advertising that is slipped in between the videos that they're watching is sometimes feels a little bit Wild West to me. How do you manage that? The other very sensitive, tricky part of launching kids content is you want to be really respectful of how you deal with advertisers who want to support the show. They want to be in the mix. How do you handle that?
Yeah. So, I think we have a pretty creative approach of how we see this. In one sense, we can definitely work with advertisers in host-read scenarios. Like, it definitely has its place, and there's a great audience. I think a good chunk of our audience is very screenless. And so a lot of the families, a lot of the parents that I regularly hear from, they don't do tablets, they don't do devices. And so advertisers, these are kind of unreached markets of they're very they're hard to reach. And so in that sense, it is a great place for brands that are high on imagination, active play, those kinds of families. If you're looking for those, this is the audience for you. But I'm very excited and interested to work with brands in a deeper sense to build out stories, to build out, to help your brand, a product or your message come to life in a real story, not just a 30-second or a 60-second place, but to that whole story can come alive. It's going to be a lot more engaging and fun for the listener to hear a fun story about your brand in a fun way, and it's going to resonate with families really well.
It's awesome. Do you see I'll start to wrap with questions about your kids as you see them grow up and get a little bit older?
Yeah.
What goes through your head? Are you sort of like, I have this archive of stories that I started out telling you guys to put you to sleep at night.
Right.
Do you think about, like, first of all, how their brains have changed as they've grown up even a year or 2 or 3 years across this process, and the kind of stories that you're telling now that you started out with? But do you ever flash forward, like 50 years from now, we'll all look back at these stories and it'll just be this amazing treasure trove of stuff I did for you kids? What sort of goes through your head?
Dude, that is a wild thought that is a wild thought to think that far. And it would trip me up to think think about that. But yeah, I feel like I'm telling these stories to my kids, and I'm really in tune with that age, as it started as 2, 4, 6, and now it's 4, 6, 8, and so especially my middle son Malachi, he is very in tune. He loves these stories, and he's my like ultimate feedback. Like when we're listening at bedtime together, the stories and things that he like really responds to and laughs at, I'm like, oh, I nailed it. Yes. So he's my ultimate critic or judge in I'm like, okay, that one hit well. Yeah. So gosh, this is such a special thing that I get to do. Like, I absolutely love this, not only just as a father, being able to do something fun for my kids, but I take this responsibility seriously of speaking to hundreds of thousands of kids around the world every day. Like, that's a heavy weight, but I'm very honored and excited that I get to do that.
It's deeply grateful for your partnership. I mean, I'll say from my perspective, not only as somebody from iHeart, but actually as a dad, it is hugely important, this kind of content in the world. And we see it as a business. We want to support awesome creators like you out there in the world, especially in podcasting. But again, I see it also in my own family, like my own kids. It's such a joy to see kids gravitate towards smart, good, substantial content. So
yeah,
Jim, I really appreciate it. I thank you for hanging out with us today. It's been an awesome conversation.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you, Conal.
Thanks everybody for hanging out with us as well. We will see you next week for another session. Until then, be well, take care.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.